An account of the persecutions in Venice. While the state of Venice was free from inquisitors, a great number of Protestants fixed their residence there, and many converts were made by the purity of the doctrines they professed and the inoffensiveness of the conversation they used. The Pope, being informed of the great increase of Protestantism in the year 1542, sent inquisitors to Venice to make an inquiry into the matter, and apprehended such as they might deem obnoxious persons. Hence a severe persecution began, and many worthy persons were martyred for serving God with purity and scorning the trappings of idolatry. Various were the modes by which the Protestants were deprived of life, but one particular method, which was first invented upon this occasion, we shall describe. As soon as sentence was passed, the prisoner had an iron chain which ran through a great stone fastened to his body. He was then laid flat upon a plank, with his face upwards, and rowed between two boats to a certain distance at sea, when the two boats separated, and he was sunk to the bottom by the weight of the stone. If any denied the jurisdiction of the inquisitors at Venice, they were sent to Rome, where, being committed purposely to damp prisons and never called to a hearing, their flesh mortified, and they died miserably in jail. A citizen of Venice, Anthony Rossetti, being apprehended as a Protestant, was sentenced to be drowned in the manner we have already described. A few days previous to the time appointed for his execution, his son was sent to him, and begged him to recant, that his life might be saved, and himself not left fatherless. To which the father replied, quote, "A good Christian is bound to relinquish not only goods and children, but life itself, for the glory of his Redeemer. Therefore, I am resolved to sacrifice everything in this transitory world, for the sake of salvation in a world that will last to eternity." End quote. The lords of Venice likewise sent him word that if he would embrace the Roman Catholic religion, they would not only give him his life, but redeem a considerable estate which he had mortgaged, and freely present him with it. This, however, he absolutely refused to comply with, sending word to the nobles that he valued his soul beyond all other considerations, and being told that a fellow prisoner named Francis Sega had recanted, he answered, quote, "If he has forsaken God, I pity him, but I shall continue steadfast in my duty." End quote. Finding all endeavors to persuade him to renounce his faith ineffectual, he was executed according to his sentence, dying cheerfully and recommending his soul fervently to the Almighty. What Rossetti had been told concerning the apostasy of Francis Sega was absolutely false, for he had never offered to recant, but steadfastly persisted in his faith, and was executed a few days after Rossetti in the very same manner. Francis Spinola, a Protestant gentleman of very great learning, being apprehended by order of the inquisitors, was carried before their tribunal. A treatise on the Lord's Supper was then put into his hands, and he was asked if he knew the author of it, to which he replied, quote, "I confess myself to be the author of it, and at the same time solemnly affirm that there is not a line in it but what is authorized by and consonant to the Holy Scriptures." End quote. On this confession, he was committed close prisoner to a dungeon for several days. Being brought to a second examination, he charged the Pope's legate and the inquisitors with being merciless barbarians, and then represented the superstitions and idolatries practiced by the Church of Rome in so glaring a light that, not being able to refuse his arguments, they sent him back to his dungeon to make him repent of what he had said. On his third examination, they asked him if he would recant his error, to which he answered that the doctrines he maintained were not erroneous, being purely the same as those which Christ and his apostles had taught, and which were handed down to us in the sacred writings. The inquisitors then sentenced him to be drowned, which was executed in the manner already described. He went to meet death with the utmost serenity, seemed to wish for dissolution, and declaring that the prolongation of his life did but tend to retard that real happiness which could only be expected in the world to come. An account of several remarkable individuals who were martyred in different parts of Italy on account of their religion. John Mollius was born at Rome of reputable parents. At 12 years of age, they placed him in the monastery of Grey Friars, where he made such a rapid progress in arts, sciences, and languages that at 18 years of age, he was permitted to take priest's orders. He was then sent to Ferrara, where, after pursuing his studies 6 years longer, he was made theological reader in the university of that city. He now unhappily exerted his great talents to disguise the gospel truths and to varnish over the error of the Church of Rome. After some years' residence in Ferrara, he moved to the University of Bologna, where he became a professor. Having read some treatises written by ministers of the Reformed religion, he grew fully sensible of the errors of popery and soon became a zealous Protestant in his heart. He now determined to expound accordingly to the purity of the gospel, St. Paul's epistle to the Romans, in a regular course of sermons. The concourse of people that continually attended his preaching was surprising, but when the priests found the tenor of his doctrines, they dispatched an account of the affair to Rome, when the Pope sent a monk named Cornelius to Bologna to expound the same epistle according to the tenets of the Church of Rome. The people, however, found such a disparity between the two preachers that the audience of Mollius increased, and Cornelius was forced to preach to empty benches. Cornelius wrote an account of his bad success to the Pope, who immediately sent an order to apprehend Mollius, who was seized upon accordingly and kept in close confinement. The Bishop of Bologna sent him word that he must recant or be burnt, but he appealed to Rome and was removed. At Rome he begged to have a public trial, but that the Pope absolutely denied him, and commanded him to give an account of his opinions in writing, which he did under the following heads: Original Sin, Free Will, the Infallibility of the Church of Rome, the Infallibility of the Pope, Justification by Faith, Purgatory, Transubstantiation, Mass, Auricular Confession, Prayers for the Dead, the Host, Prayers for Saints, Going on Pilgrimages, Extreme Unction, Performing Services in an Unknown Tongue, etc. All these he confirmed from Scripture authority. The Pope, upon this occasion, for political reasons, spared him for the present, but soon after had him apprehended and put to death, he being first hanged, and his body burnt to ashes, A.D. 1553. The year after, Francis Gamba, a Lombard of the Protestant persuasion, was apprehended and condemned to death by the Senate of Milan. At the place of execution, a monk presented a cross to him, to whom he said, quote, "My mind is so full of real merits and goodness of Christ that I want not a piece of senseless stick to put me in mind of him." End quote. For this expression, his tongue was bored through, and he was afterward burnt. A.D. 1555, Algerius, a student in the University of Padua and a man of great learning, having embraced the Reformed religion, did all he could to convert others. For these proceedings he was accused of heresy to the Pope, and being apprehended, was committed to the prison at Venice. The Pope, being informed of Algerius's great learning and surprising natural abilities, thought it would be of infinite service to the Church of Rome if he could induce him to forsake the Protestant cause. He therefore sent for him to Rome, and tried by the most profane promises to win him to his purpose. But finding his endeavors ineffectual, he ordered him to be burnt, which sentence was executed accordingly. A.D. 1559, John Aloysius, being sent from Geneva to preach in Calabria, was there apprehended as a Protestant, carried to Rome, and burnt by order of the Pope. And James Boevilius, for the same reason, was burnt at Messina. A.D. 1560, Pope Pius IV ordered all the Protestants to be severely persecuted throughout all the Italian states, when great numbers of every age, sex, and condition suffered martyrdom. Concerning the cruelties practiced upon this occasion, a learned and humane Roman Catholic thus spoke of them in a letter to a noble lord: "I cannot, my lord, forbear disclosing my sentiments with respect to the persecution now carrying on. I think it cruel and unnecessary. I tremble at the manner of putting to death, as it resembles more than the slaughter of calves and sheep, the execution of human beings. I will relate to your lordship a dreadful scene, of which I myself was an eyewitness. 70 Protestants were cooped up in one filthy dungeon together. The executioner went in among them, picked out one from among the rest, blindfolded him, led him out to an open place before the prison, and cut his throat with the greatest composure. He then calmly walked into the prison again, bloody as he was, and with the knife in his hand selected another, and dispatched him in the same manner. And this, my lord, he repeated until the whole number were put to death. I leave it to your lordship's feelings to judge of my sensations upon this occasion. My tears now wash the paper upon which I give you the recital. Another thing I must mention, the patience with which they met death. They seemed all resignation and piety, fervently praying to God and cheerfully encountering their fate. I cannot reflect without shuddering how the executioner held the bloody knife between his teeth. What a dreadful figure he appeared, all covered with blood, and with what unconcern he executed his barbarous office. A young Englishman who happened to be at Rome was one day passing by a church, when the procession of the host was just coming out. A bishop carried the host, which the young man perceiving, he snatched it from him, threw it upon the ground, and trampled it under his feet, crying out, quote, "Ye wretched idolaters, who neglect the true God to adore a morsel of bread." End quote. This action so provoked the people that they would have torn him to pieces on the spot, but the priest persuaded them to let him abide by the sentence of the Pope. When the affair was presented to the Pope, he was so greatly exasperated that he offered the prisoner to be burnt immediately. But a cardinal dissuaded him from this hasty sentence, saying that it was better to punish him by slow degrees and to torture him, that they might find out if he had been instigated by any particular person to commit so atrocious an act. This being approved, he was tortured with the most exemplary severity, notwithstanding which they could only get these words from him, quote, "It was the will of God that I should do as I did." End quote. The Pope then passed this sentence upon him. 1. That he should be led by the executioner, naked to the middle, through the streets of Rome. 2. That he should wear the image of the devil upon his head. 3. That his breeches should be painted with the representation of flames. 4. That he should have his right hand cut off. 5. That after having been carried about thus in procession, he should be burnt. When he heard this sentence pronounced, he implored God to give him strength and fortitude to go through it. As he passed through the streets, he was greatly derided by the people, to whom he said some severe things respecting the Romish superstition. But a cardinal who attended the procession, overhearing him, ordered him to be gagged. When he came to the church door where he trampled on the host, the hangman cut off his right hand and fixed it on a pole. Then 2 tormentors with flaming torches scorched and burnt his flesh all the rest of the way. At the place of execution, he kissed the chains that were to bind him to the stake. A monk presenting the figure of a saint to him, he struck it aside, and then being chained to the stake, fire was put to the faggots, and he was soon burnt to ashes. A little after the last mentioned execution, a venerable old man who had long been a prisoner in the Inquisition was condemned to be burnt and brought out for execution. When he was fastened to the stake, a priest held a crucifix to him, on which he said, quote, "If you do not take the idol from my sight, you will constrain me to spit upon it." End quote. The priest rebuked him for this with great severity, but he bade him remember the first and second commandments and refrain from idolatry, as God himself had commanded. He was then gagged that he should not speak any more, and fire being put to the faggots, he suffered martyrdom in the flames. An account of the persecutions in the Marquisate of Salluses. The Marquisate of Salluses, on the south side of the valleys of Piedmont, was in AD 1561, principally inhabited by the Protestants, when the Marquis, who was proprietor of it, began a persecution against them at the instigation of the Pope. He began by banishing the ministers, and if any of them refused to leave their flocks, they were sure to be imprisoned and severely tortured. However, he did not proceed so far as to put any to death. Soon after, the marquis fell into the possession of the Duke of Savoy, who sent circular letters to all the towns and villages that he expected the people should all conform to go to Mass. The inhabitants of Saluces, upon receiving this letter, returned a general epistle in answer. The Duke, after reading the letter, did not interpret the Protestants for some time, but at length he sent them word that they must either conform to the Mass or leave his dominions in 15 days. The Protestants, upon this unexpected edict, sent a deputy to the Duke to obtain its revocation, or at least to have it moderated. But the remonstrances were in vain, and they were given to understand that the edict was absolute. Some were weak enough to go to Mass in order to avoid banishment and preserve their property. Others removed with all their effects to different countries, and many neglected the time so long that they were obliged to abandon all they were worth and leave the marquisate in haste. Those who unhappily stayed behind were seized, plundered, and put to death. An account of the persecutions in the valleys of Piedmont in the 17th century. Pope Clement VIII sent missionaries into the valleys of Piedmont to induce the Protestants to renounce their religion, and these missionaries, having erected monasteries in several parts of the valleys, became exceedingly troublesome to those of the Reformed, where the monasteries appeared not only as fortresses to curb, but as sanctuaries for all such to fly to as had any ways injured them. The Protestants petitioned the Duke of Savoy against these missionaries, whose insolence and ill usage were become intolerable. But instead of getting any redress, the interest of the missionaries so far prevailed that the Duke published a decree in which he declared that one witness should be sufficient in a court of law against the Protestant, and that any witness who convicted a Protestant of any crime whatever should be entitled to 100 crowns. It may be easily imagined upon the publication of a decree of this nature that many Protestants fell martyrs to perjury and avarice, for several villainous papists would swear by anything against the Protestants for the sake of the reward, and then fly to their own priests for absolution from their false oaths. If any Roman Catholic of more conscience than the rest blamed these fellows for their atrocious crimes, they themselves were in danger of being informed against and punished as favorers of heretics. The missionaries did all they could to get the books of the Protestants into their hands in order to burn them. When the Protestants, doing their utmost endeavors to conceal their books, the missionaries wrote to the Duke of Savoy, who, for the heinous crime of not surrendering their Bibles, prayer books, and religious treatises, sent a number of troops to be quartered on them. These military gentry did great mischief in the house of the Protestants and destroyed such quantities of provisions that many families were thereby ruined. To encourage as much as possible the apostasy of the Protestants, the Duke of Savoy published a proclamation wherein he said, quote, "To encourage the heretics to turn Catholics, it is our will and pleasure, and we do hereby expressly command that all such as shall embrace the Holy Roman Catholic faith shall enjoy an exemption from all and every tax for the space of 5 years, commencing from the day of their conversion." End quote. The Duke of Savoy likewise established a court called the Council for Extirpating the Heretics. This court was to enter into inquiries concerning the ancient privileges of the Protestant churches and the decrees which had been, for time to time, made in favor of the Protestants. But the investigation of these things was carried on with the most manifest partiality. Old charters were wrested to a wrong sense, and sophistry was used to pervert the meaning of everything which tended to favor the Reformed. As if these severities were not sufficient, the Duke soon after published another edict in which he strictly commanded that no Protestant should act as a schoolmaster or tutor, either in public or private, or dare to teach any art, science, or language, directly or indirectly, to persons of any persuasion whatever. This edict was immediately followed by another, which decreed that no Protestant should hold any place of profit, trust, or honor. And to wind up the whole, the certain token of an approaching persecution came forth in a final edict, by which it was positively ordered that all Protestants should diligently attend Mass. The publication of an edict containing such an injunction may be compared to unfurling the bloody flag, for murder and rapine were sure to follow. One of the first objects that attracted the notice of the papist was Mr. Sebastian Bazin, a zealous Protestant who was seized by the missionaries, confined, tormented for 15 months, and then burnt. Previous to the persecution, the missionaries employed kidnappers to steal away the Protestants' children, that they might privately be brought up Roman Catholics. But now they took away the children by open force, and if they met with any resistance, they murdered the parents. To give greater vigor to the persecution, the Duke of Savoy called the General Assembly of the Roman Catholic nobility and gentry when a solemn edict was published against the Reformed, containing many heads, and including several reasons for extirpating the Protestants, among which were the following: 1. For the preservation of the papal authority. 2. That the church livings may be all under one mode of government. 3. To make a union among all parties. 4. In honor of all the saints and of the ceremonies of the Church of Rome. This severe edict was followed by a most cruel order published on January 25th, AD 1655, under the Duke's sanction by Andrew Gastaldo, Doctor of Civil Laws. This order set forth that every head of a family, with the individuals of that family, of the Reformed religion, of what rank, degree, or condition soever, none excepted inhabiting the possessing estates in Lucerne, St. Giovanni, Bibbiena, Campiglione, St. Secondo, Lucernetta, La Torre, Finelle, and Bricciariccio, and will be withdrawn of the said places and translated into the places and limits tolerated by His Highness during his pleasure, particularly Bobbio, Angrone, Villario, Rorata, and the country of Bonetti. And all this to be done on pain of death and confiscation of house and goods, unless within the limited time they turned Roman Catholics. A flight with such speed in the midst of winter may be conceived as no agreeable task, especially in a country almost surrounded by mountains. The sudden order affected all, and things, which would have been scarcely noticed at another time, now appeared in the most conspicuous light. Women with children, or women just lain in, were not objects of pity on this order for sudden removal, for all were included in the command, and it unfortunately happened that the winter was remarkably severe and rigorous. The papists, however, drove the people from their habitations at the time appointed, without even suffering them to the sufficient clothes to cover them, and many perished in the mountains through the severity of the weather, or for want of food. Some, however, who remained behind after the decree was published, met with the severest treatment, being murdered by the popish inhabitants, or shot by the troops who were quartered in the valleys. A particular description of these cruelties is given in a letter written by a Protestant who was upon the spot, and who happily escaped the carnage. The army, says he, having got footing, became very numerous by the addition of a multitude of the neighboring popish inhabitants, who, finding we were the destined prey of the plunderers, fell upon us with an impetuous fury. Exclusive of the Duke of Savoy's troops and the popish inhabitants, there were several regiments of French auxiliaries, some companies belonging to the Irish brigades, and several bands formed of outlaws, smugglers, and prisoners who had been promised pardon and liberty in this world, and absolution in the next, for assisting to exterminate the Protestants from Piedmont. This armed multitude, being encouraged by the Roman Catholic bishops and monks, fell upon the Protestants in a most furious manner. Nothing now was to be seen but the face of horror and despair. Blood stained the floors of the houses, dead bodies bestrewed the streets, groans and cries were heard from all parts. Some armed themselves and skirmished with the troops, and many, with their families, fled to the mountains. In one village they cruelly tormented 150 women and children after the men were fled, beheading the women and dashing out the brains of the children. In the towns of Villario and Bobbio, most of those who refused to go to Mass, who were upwards of 15 years of age, they crucified with their heads downwards, and the greatest numbers of those who were under that age were strangled. Sarah Radonole de Vignes, a woman of 60 years of age, being seized by some soldiers, they ordered her to say a prayer to some saints, which she refusing, they thrust a sickle into her belly, ripped her up, and then cut off her head. Martha Constantine, a handsome young woman was treated with great indecency and cruelty by several of the troops, who first ravished and then killed her by cutting off her breasts. These they fried and set before some of their comrades, who ate them without knowing what they were. When they had done eating, the others told them what they had made a meal of, in consequence of which a quarrel ensued, swords were drawn, and a battle took place. Several were killed in the fray, the greater part of whom were those concerned in the horrid massacre of the woman, and who had practiced such an inhuman deception on their companions. Some of the soldiers seized a man of Thrasanere and ran the points of their swords through his ears and through his feet. They then tore off the nails of his fingers and toes with red-hot pincers, tied him to the tail of an ass, and dragged him about the streets. They finally fastened a cord around his head, which they twisted with a stick in so violent a manner as to wring it from his body. Peter Simons, a Protestant of about 80 years of age, was tied neck and heels and then thrown down a precipice. In the fall, the branch of a tree caught hold of the ropes that fastened him and suspended him in the midway, so that he languished for several days, and at length miserably perished of hunger. Issei Garcino, refusing to renounce his religion, was cut into small pieces, the soldiers in ridicule saying they had minced him. A woman named Armande had every limb separated from each other, and then the respective parts were hung upon a hedge. 2 old women were ripped open and then left in the fields upon the snow, where they perished, and a very old woman, who was deformed, had her nose and hands cut off, and was left to bleed to death in that manner. A great number of men, women, and children were flung from the rocks and dashed to pieces. Magdalene Bertino, a Protestant woman of La Torre, was stripped stark naked, her head tied between her legs and thrown down one of the precipices, and Mary Remondet, of the same town, had the flesh sliced from her bones until she expired. Magdalene Pilot of Velario was cut to pieces in the cave of Castolas. Anne Chabanais had one end of a stake thrust up her body, and the other being fixed in the ground, she was left in that manner to perish. And Jacob Perrin, the elder of the church of Velario, and David his brother, were flayed alive. An inhabitant of La Torre, named Giovanni Andrea Michelam, was apprehended with 4 of his children. 3 of them were hacked to pieces before him. The soldiers asking him at the death of every child if he would renounce his religion, this he constantly refused. One of the soldiers then took up the last and youngest by the legs, and putting the same question to the father, he replied as before, when the inhuman brute dashed out the child's brains. The father, however, at the same moment started from them and fled. The soldiers fired after him, but missed, and he, by the swiftness of his heels, escaped and hid himself in the Alps.